In an age where devotion and hostility walked hand in hand, the people of Israel endured a heavy season of fear and fragmentation. Foreign empires, insatiable in their hunger for land and dominion, extended their shadows over smaller nations like storm clouds, darkening the edge of the sky. But not all dangers wore the armor of a soldier. Some wounds came from those once called brothers. Among the most bitter of these betrayals stood Edom. The descendants of Esau, twin brother to Jacob, had long since severed the sacred thread of kinship. Rather than compassion, they chose contempt. Rather than aid, they offered ambush. At each stumble of Israel, Edom rejoiced. At every sign of weakness, they moved in like scavengers circling the wounded. On jagged cliffs overlooking the desert plains, the Edomites built their cities with stone and arrogance. Their homes clung to rock faces as if daring the world to challenge their might. From these heights, they gazed upon Israel's turmoil with a mixture of superiority and disdain, convinced their position rendered them invulnerable. Their hearts swelled with vanity, convinced that altitude granted them immunity not only from enemy armies, but from justice itself. It was a time when trust unraveled easily. Violence was not only fought with spears, but whispered through broken treaties and silences that once held promises. Israel's battle was not confined to foreign soldiers. It raged also in the bitterness of watching relatives dance on the ashes of shared history. And amid this grim backdrop, a quiet name began to circulate. Not shouted, not praised, but remembered: Obadiah. Little is known of the man behind the name. His lineage is undocumented, his birthplace a mystery swallowed by time. Some whispered that he was born in a forgotten village tucked between hills where shepherds spoke more to stars than to men. Others believed he had grown up within sacred walls, perhaps raised in the temple courts, molded in the quiet discipline of solitude and scripture. But whether he came from the fields or the temple, one truth outshined all speculation. His message would speak louder than any biography ever could. Obadiah did not command attention through dramatic oratory or bold declarations. Yet those who met his gaze often felt as if they had been seen more clearly than ever before. There was a weight in his presence, a sense of deep stillness that unnerved those addicted to noise. He was not the kind of man who needed to speak much. His silence was a language in itself. From his earliest days, Obadiah seemed drawn to heights, not to boast, but to listen. While his peers pursued glory or gold, he walked the winding trails alone, seeking the hush of the mountaintop. There, in the whisper of the wind and the shifting sands, he began to hear something that others could not: a burden. What stirred within him was not ambition, it was not vengeance, it was something deeper. A pull, a calling, a holy unease. At night, while others rested, Obadiah watched the sky, searching, listening, waiting. He believed that everything had meaning: the crack in a stone, the silence after thunder, the sadness in a child's eyes. And somehow, it all seemed to speak of something coming. What fueled this quiet prophet's yearning for solitude? What gave his eyes that flicker of foreknowledge? No one could say. Perhaps even he didn't fully grasp the weight pressing against his soul. But there, in the stillness, something sacred took root. For in a land broken by betrayal and brimming with enemies, God chose not a king or a warrior to carry his voice, but a man unknown, unnoticed, unarmed. Obadiah had no throne, no troops, and no title. What he did have was trust and a willingness to say yes. As the tension between Edom and Israel escalated like clouds before a storm, Obadiah could feel the approach of something irreversible. He did not yet know what he would say, but he sensed it would demand everything he had. He understood that this was not merely about politics or power, but about confronting the most dangerous idol of all, human pride. And in that moment, obscured from the chronicles of men but etched in eternity, a prophet rose, not with sword, but with truth. In the stillness of the hills, where only the wind dared speak and silence held its own rhythm, a quiet unfolding had begun. A story not foretold in royal courts or etched in scrolls, but whispered gently into the soul of a man who had not asked for greatness, only for peace. Obadiah wandered, caught between the ordinary and the divine, trapped in a tension he could neither name nor shake. While the rest of the world busied itself with harvests and household concerns, he lived suspended in an invisible tug-of-war. Something unseen had begun to rest heavily upon him. It pressed on his chest during the day and stirred his sleep at night. He did not know what it was, only that it was real. More and more, he retreated from the bustle of human voices. His feet found paths no one traveled, winding trails that hugged the edges of cliffs and vanished into canyons. There, among rocks polished by centuries of wind, he sought no answers, only the comfort of being alone with the unease swelling inside him. He had no words for it, no questions to ask, just a growing awareness that his spirit was being prepared for something that defied explanation. At night, he sat beneath the heavens. The stars stretched endlessly above him, silent and unmoving. And yet he stared as if expecting one of them to break its pattern and speak. Sometimes the breeze carried to his ears faint murmurings, no language he could understand, but laden with a weight that stirred his heart. Other times it wasn't sound, but a hush so profound that it seemed to breathe with purpose. Then one night, everything changed. The sky was unusually clear, the kind of clarity that made even the most distant stars pulse like flames. The desert air was sharp, slicing through his robe and grazing his skin. As Obadiah fixed his gaze on the horizon, something within him shifted. Suddenly, images surged into his vision, not imagined, not dreamed, but vivid and unavoidable. He saw mountain ranges collapsing into dust, grand cities reduced to rubble, dry riverbeds twisting through wastelands, scorched beneath a blood-red sun. He blinked hard, trying to push the scenes away. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps hunger had tricked his mind, but the visions clung to his sight, clearer with each passing moment. He wasn't dreaming. He was being shown something real. Frightened yet strangely compelled, Obadiah rose and began to walk. His steps were unsteady. The desert night, once familiar and still, now felt alive with mystery. Why him? Why these visions? He was no prophet, no elder, no teacher. He bore no titles, no recognition. He was just a man who listened more than he spoke. And yet the heavens had chosen him as a witness. In the days that followed, he told no one. He carried the images in silence, unsure whether they were gifts or curses. Who would believe him? Who would understand the agony of seeing destruction that had not yet come, of bearing messages meant for ears unwilling to hear? But the visions did not relent. They appeared in quiet moments, while scooping water from a stream, while stacking dry wood for a fire, even while lying asleep. Always the same thread of ruin, always the sense that something vast and irreversible was breaking apart. Slowly, Obadiah began to grasp the truth. Escape was not an option. The visions were not passing dreams. They were seeds planted in his spirit, germinating in silence, until the day they would bloom into prophecy. He didn't know what to do yet. He was afraid, but he no longer questioned that he had been chosen. And as that realization took root, so did a quiet acceptance. His life would not return to what it was, not because he desired change, but because purpose often calls to those who least seek it. Sometimes destiny prefers the company of the unnoticed, the soft-hearted, the ones who have learned to hear the breeze when it carries more than air. One morning, as the sun bled faint streaks of crimson over the mountain ridges, Obadiah felt it again. Not the usual chill of early dawn, not the emptiness of open trails, but a presence, unseen yet unmistakably near. His skin tingled, his chest tightened. Someone was drawing close. Standing atop a tall stone, his eyes on the wide horizon, Obadiah's knees weakened. In his mind's sky, once so serene, clouds began to gather, not of weather, but of revelation. Something was coming, and he had been chosen to see it first. He closed his eyes, and the world within him exploded. Vivid, unrelenting visions surged like lightning through his soul, robbing him of breath and stillness. Towers of stone, once proud and immovable, crumbled like dust into the wind. Valleys drowned in smoke. Strongholds that had once promised safety collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. Men and women scattered like leaves in a storm, searching desperately for shelter where none could be found. Chaos reigned. Emptiness echoed. Destruction was complete. And in the center of the ruin, a voice spoke. Not from the sky, not from the earth, but from the very depths of his being. It did not ask for permission. It did not whisper. It thundered with an undeniable authority that pierced him to his core. Edom will fall. Their pride will be their undoing. There will be no refuge for the arrogant. Obadiah's eyes flew open. The landscape around him remained unchanged, the same mountains, the same rocks. But something within him had shifted irrevocably. It was not a dream. It wasn't a fleeting thought. It was a command, a summons that could not be silenced. For days he walked in silence, his soul raw and restless. The vision clung to him like a shadow. Why Edom? Why was such a weighty declaration entrusted to him, a man with no title, no fame, no known voice? His mind wrestled with the questions, but his heart no longer entertained doubt. He had been chosen, not for comfort, not for honor, but to speak a truth no one wanted to hear. Each night, the visions returned, sometimes cloaked in sorrow, other times violent and jarring. He saw covenants shatter like glass. He saw hands that once offered peace twist into betrayal. He saw familiar paths become deadly traps. And again, the same truth rang out. Edom's downfall would not come from an enemy, but from within. From the pride that blinded them. It was not a message to simply announce. It was a burden to carry, a judgment heavy with grief. Obadiah understood that to speak this truth was to invite rejection. People would not celebrate him. They would condemn him. His words would be dismissed, mocked, maybe even erased. But they could not remain unsaid. He struggled. He resisted. At times, he longed to forget everything, to pretend the visions had never come, to return to his quiet, nameless life. But the more he tried to run, the more his spirit ached. Ignoring the calling felt like suffocating slowly. One evening, as fierce winds tore across the slopes, Obadiah collapsed to his knees on the jagged earth. His lips formed no words. His tears said everything. It wasn't a cry of despair. It was surrender. He realized he could not carry this mission in his own strength. He needed something beyond himself, something unshakable, a strength not born from within, but given from above. And in that quiet moment, there were no voices, no fire, no thunder, just stillness. But within that stillness, a peace settled over him like a warm cloak. It was not the absence of fear, but the presence of assurance. It was as if the heavens, silent as they were, had gently confirmed, "You are not alone." Obadiah stood, not because the fear had vanished, but because the purpose had become stronger than the fear. His heart still trembled, but his steps were steady. He would speak, no matter the outcome. Whether his voice was met with scorn or silence, it did not matter. He had been called, and his only task now was to answer. The questions still remained. How would he deliver the message? When would the moment come? How does a lone man confront a kingdom with nothing but words? He had no answers. Perhaps he never would. But he knew that when the time arrived, obedience was all that would be required. With deliberate steps, he began the descent. Each stone beneath his feet reminded him that he no longer walked for himself. He had become a messenger of something far greater than his own life. He carried not comfort, but confrontation, not peace, but prophecy. And though he did not realize it, The echo of his footsteps was already stirring the winds of change. The mountains, the valleys, the very dust of the earth seemed to recognize it. Something had begun. The days that followed were a storm inside Obadiah. Though his feet followed the same dusty paths as always, Obadiah's mind was no longer at peace. Every step carried with it an invisible struggle, a silent war between surrender and resistance. With each sunrise, the weight on his shoulders grew heavier, not from the burden of labor, but from the gravity of a message he had never asked to bear. In the daylight hours, he tried to mask the transformation. He drew water, gathered branches, greeted strangers with quiet kindness. But beneath that surface lay an ever-present tension. A voice within him, quiet but unrelenting, reminded him that the days of anonymity had ended. He was no longer just a quiet wanderer with a fondness for solitude. He had become the keeper of a fire that could not be extinguished. Fear found him easily. Not the fear of death or pain, but the deeper fear of being ignored, the terror of speaking and being dismissed, the ache of failing in a mission that felt too large for any one man, especially one as unremarkable as he. How could someone with no status, no reputation, no army of followers confront a nation like Edom, fiercely proud and certain of its strength? Night after night, as he lay beneath the stars, he was tempted to withdraw. He rehearsed arguments with himself. Surely there was someone wiser, he thought, someone more articulate, more respected. Maybe the visions had been a mistake. Perhaps he had misunderstood what God expected of him. But those thoughts never lasted. For every doubt that crept into his mind, an even deeper conviction rose to meet it. This wasn't about worthiness. It wasn't about eloquence or courage. It was about obedience. Even if his knees shook, even if no one listened, there was one afternoon he would never forget. He sat in the shade of a weathered olive tree, gazing toward the mountains that divided Israel from Edom. In his mind, he pictured the fortified cities, the smug faces of those who took pride in the suffering of others. He felt the message pressing against his chest again, weighty, urgent, terrifying, and once more doubt tried to claim him. Who am I to speak judgment, he thought. I'm as flawed and fearful as the people I'm meant to warn. For hours he sat there, locked in a battle no one could see, wrestling not with enemies but with himself. As dusk wrapped the land in gold and shadow, something shifted in him. A realization broke through the storm. The message was not his. The burden was not his to define. What mattered was not how the message would be received, but that it would be delivered, that he would be faithful to the voice that had found him in silence. He drew a deep breath, letting the cold evening air fill his lungs. Then he stood, not because the fear had vanished, but because he no longer needed it to. He understood now that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Without seeking praise or expecting reward, Obadiah embraced the path before him. And in that quiet, resolute moment, he joined the lineage of those who changed history, not by force, but by faith. In the days that followed, a sense of urgency began to pulse inside him, constant as a drumbeat. He felt the moment drawing near, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon, and yet many questions remained unanswered. He still didn't know how he would speak, what words he would use, or how to ensure his voice was not mistaken for mere opinion, but recognized as the echo of the divine. There were no clear instructions, no scroll descended from the heavens, no booming voice to guide his every move. What he had received was far more subtle and far more powerful, a certainty that bypassed logic and rooted itself deep in his soul. So he prepared the only way he knew how, through quiet. He shunned crowds. He walked where no one followed. He listened to the rustle of the wind across the cliffs, letting the silence sharpen him. He prayed without words. He waited without fear. Because Obadiah knew that readiness wasn't about knowing the plan. It was about being willing to step into it when the time came. In solitude, Obadiah continued to refine the quiet instrument of his heart. Each morning, as light returned to the earth and his eyes opened to the same rugged hills, he would wonder, is this the day? Will my voice finally rise among the people? And every night, before surrendering to sleep, he would renew his silent vow to remain faithful even if the timing of heaven remained veiled. On certain nights, when the stars shimmered with unusual clarity, he would feel something difficult to define. Not quite a thought, not fully an emotion. It was as if the vastness above him whispered a confirmation not in language, but in stillness. Whether it was a fleeting image or a truth breathed into his soul, he could not say. He only knew he was not walking alone. The absence of specific instructions didn't weaken his resolve. It deepened his dependence. He no longer needed explanations. He only needed to trust. To prepare, Obadiah would revisit every vision etched into his memory. He would retrace the inner terrain where the calling had first stirred, not to reinterpret it or reshape it, but to ensure the message remained untouched by his own opinions. He was not its author, he was its vessel. But he trained not only his spirit, his body too was made ready. He walked for hours over stones and slopes, teaching his legs endurance and his lungs patience. He knew that when the moment came, it would demand strength of every kind, the discipline of a messenger who had been forged in silence. Around him, the world carried on, oblivious. Markets bustled, children laughed, trade routes remained busy. No one sensed the storm that loomed beyond the horizon. No one knew that in a quiet corner, a man was preparing to deliver words that would shake the proud. There were no crowds to witness his preparation, no cheers, no affirmations. And perhaps that was how it had to be. This mission was never meant to be about fame, it was about fidelity. Then, one morning, something changed. Not in the sky or in the wind, but within him. The trembling in his chest faded. A calmness took its place, not born of confidence, but of clarity. He didn't need a sign, he didn't need a vision. The time had come. He could feel it in the rhythm of the day. With quiet determination, Obadiah began the descent toward Edom. The path was steep and uneven. Every step pressed against the weight he carried. Though the mountains still stood proud and unmoved, they seemed to watch him now, their silence heavy with anticipation. He knew they had long guarded a people confident in their own strength, people who laughed at warnings and ignored wisdom. When he finally reached one of Edom's prominent towns, life there was vibrant. Merchants shouted their prices, guards walked with arrogant ease, and noblemen gathered near marble statues, monuments to their imagined invincibility. Obadiah stepped into the heart of the square. He wore no fine robes. His feet were caked with dust, and his expression bore the fatigue of one who had crossed not just landscapes, but inner deserts of fear and hesitation. Yet his eyes were clear. His voice, when it rose, did not tremble. He spoke, not with rage, not with theatrical flair, but with the calm weight of certainty. Each word struck the air like a chisel against stone. "The Most High has seen your pride," he declared. "You have built your homes on cliffs and hidden yourselves in fortresses, believing you are beyond reach. But it is your arrogance that will undo you." For a heartbeat, silence held the square. A few faces turned. A breathless hush hovered in the heat of the afternoon. Then came the laughter. A vendor, grinning with amused disbelief, called out, "And who are you, stranger, to speak doom over us?" His voice dripped with mockery. Others joined in, chuckling, shaking their heads. Obadiah stood still. He did not respond to the insult. He had expected the scorn. It mattered little. He was not there for applause. He had not come to be believed, only to be faithful. Because truth, once spoken, does not return empty. "You don't even carry a sword," one man jeered. Another, voice thick with sarcasm, added, "What are you going to do? Bring down our walls with poetry?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Some crossed their arms with smug grins. Others rolled their eyes and walked away without interest. Their amusement echoed across the plaza like the sound of men who had never known fear. Obadiah didn't flinch. He hadn't come to argue. He wasn't there to engage in a contest of wit or pride. He had been sent to deliver, not to defend. So he stood where he was, his feet unmoving, and his voice, quiet but charged with thunder, rose again. You trust in your allies, in your wealth, in the height of your fortresses. But those who call themselves your friends will soon turn their backs. Your walls will not hold. Your strength will become your trap. This time the laughter didn't come so easily. A few faces stiffened. The smirks faded into tight lines. Not because they suddenly believed, but because a splinter of truth had slipped past their armor. Deep down, some knew their alliances were fragile, built not on loyalty, but on shared convenience. Among the elders, murmurs began, whispers too quiet for the soldiers to hear. Among the youth, there was less restraint. Some hurled stones toward where Obadiah stood, not to injure, but to intimidate. A warning, you are not welcome here. Still, Obadiah didn't budge. He didn't raise his hands to protect himself. He didn't shout back. He remained planted like a solitary tree braving a sudden storm. The dust swirled around him, the tension thickened, and the sky above Edom seemed to darken without warning. Then came the soldiers. A handful approached, led by a man whose voice carried the cold weight of command. Leave now. You've said enough. Obadiah bowed his head, a gesture of respect, not submission. He turned to go, but not before offering one last message. His voice, steady as ever, carved through the air like a final arrow. As you rejoiced in the downfall of your brothers, so will your enemies rejoice when you fall. And the day of your fall is closer than you think. Then he walked away. No one stopped him. The silence behind him stretched longer than it should have. The square, once filled with noise and arrogance, now felt strangely subdued. The laughter had vanished. The air carried something else now, an unease that didn't show in expressions, but lived somewhere deeper. As Obadiah stepped beyond the city's edge, he felt neither victory nor failure. This wasn't about winning a crowd. It wasn't about changing hearts in a single moment. His task was simpler and harder: to speak, to warn, to be faithful. The seed had been sown. Whether it would grow or not, he could not say. That part belonged to time. That night, Edom slept as it always had, confident, careless, convinced of its own permanence. But in a few minds, the words of the stranger returned like an echo they couldn't quite ignore. And in some hearts, a faint crack had formed, thin, silent, but undeniable. Under the pale gaze of the moon, Obadiah knelt alone. He didn't ask for vengeance. He didn't pray for signs. He simply asked for strength to continue. He knew that the fiercest battle would not be fought with weapons, but against the stone walls of pride. And though the road ahead would be long and void of applause, he was prepared to walk it until the end. Back in Edom, life resumed. The markets buzzed. The elders drank. The leaders praised their own power and toasted to their imagined invincibility. But behind the veil of normalcy, something had begun to shift. Far from the stone cities, in distant tents and quiet conversations, Edom's allies whispered with unease. Promises once made in comfort now felt like chains. Old friendships, built on shared interest, began to decay. Obadiah, somewhere beyond the reach of cities, received new visions, clear and cutting. Not of foreign armies charging with banners, but of familiar faces, trusted hands. Edom would not fall by siege, but by betrayal. The downfall would not come from outside, but from within. And already, in shaded chambers and silent corridors, the plans had begun. New alliances were sealed with handshakes no one could see, hidden gestures behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the people. The same nations that had once stood with Edom in trade and war were now carefully preparing to walk away. not through open confrontation, but with cold calculation. At the very moment Edom would cry out for support, it would find only silence. Obadiah knew the betrayal would not come like thunder. It would creep in like dusk, gradually, inevitably. First, the caravans would arrive late. Then military reinforcements would be denied under the guise of technical difficulties. And finally, when Edom stood most exposed, those once called allies would be the first to cast stones. Yet the leaders of Edom, drunk on their own pride, refused to see it. They toasted to agreements already broken, clung to promises already buried in dust. What they celebrated as strength was in truth a snare waiting to spring shut. And so, the warning that Obadiah had once delivered in a trembling voice, ridiculed by crowds and dismissed by rulers, began to unfold, slowly, quietly, unstoppably. Though the prophet was not present to witness every shift, his spirit felt the unraveling. The winds that once carried the illusion of security now whispered of fracture and decay. One night, under a sky scattered with cold, silent stars, Obadiah knelt in the wilderness. He did not pray for revenge. He did not ask for justice in his name. His only request was this, that when the judgment arrived, at least a few hearts would bow. That mercy might still be found, even in the rubble. Edom's grave was not dug by enemy hands, but by its own misplaced trust. Trust in loyalties as unstable as sand stirred by the breeze. And the prophecy, once scorned, now walked quietly among them, step by step, while the proud remained unaware that the ending had already begun. The fall of Edom did not come with trumpet blasts or marching armies. There were no sieges, no battles sung about in songs, no blood-stained fields to mark its defeat. Instead, its collapse unfolded in silence, like a crack inching through stone, invisible at first, until the mountain it divides finally crumbles. It began with small signs, caravans that never arrived, messengers who failed to return, vows once etched into stone, now forgotten without ceremony. The leaders of Edom dismissed the signs. Delays are common, they said. There's nothing to worry about. But under the surface, unease spread like ink in water. Some traders, reading the signs, quietly withdrew their goods. Soldiers stationed at remote outposts received confusing orders, no longer sure whom they served or whether they should obey. Each piece fell out of place with barely a sound, but the picture they formed was unmistakable. Obadiah, distant yet deeply attuned, felt the pulse of the moment. He didn't need to witness the downfall to recognize it. The words once carved into his soul were now becoming reality, not with war cries, but with withheld aid, not with swords drawn, but with hands withdrawn. When Edom called for help, those who once broke bread with them looked away. Worse still, some saw opportunity in Edom's desperation. They looted behind the curtain of diplomacy. They plundered what they once praised. The fortresses, once proud and towering, were now hollow. Bereft of support, trade, and trust, they stood like empty cages. In the plazas, once filled with boasts and pride, now lingered silence and confusion. Citizens turned to their rulers with anxious eyes, waiting for direction, for clarity, for answers. None came. One morning, the news spread like wildfire through Edom. One of their longtime allies had attacked a border outpost. The rumor moved faster than the soldiers. Faces that once bore expressions of disdain now revealed confusion, fear, and disbelief. The walls they had worshipped as symbols of safety could not keep out the quiet erosion of trust. There was no declaration of war, no trumpet sounded. What followed was not a military siege, but a collapse of character, a slow unraveling of the very fabric that had held Edom together. Just as Obadiah had foreseen, the nation's pride had planted the seeds of its own destruction. From a distant place, the prophet watched the unfolding events with a mixture of sorrow and stillness. He did not rejoice in their suffering. He found no satisfaction in their fall, but he saw justice fulfilled, not vengeance, but truth taking its course. Edom's defeat did not come at the hands of a superior force. It came through blindness, through misplaced trust in stone walls and dishonest friendships. The unraveling had begun long before the betrayal ever showed its face. And so it happened, not with fire or sword, but like wind eroding stone, quietly, steadily, until nothing stood. Over time, Obadiah's figure faded from memory, like the echo of a drum once struck in the distance. No tales were recorded of his final days. No monuments bore his name. No songs were sung to preserve his story. He vanished unnoticed into the wilderness, carrying with him the peace of one who had fulfilled his calling. While Edom grappled with the consequences of its arrogance, Obadiah chose silence. He did not return for recognition. He did not wait for thanks. His purpose had never been earthly praise.